What's up everybody, this is Ryan here. So in this video we are going to be talking about a particularly confusing term in programming, which is abbreviated to API, which stands for Application Programming Interface. So generally speaking, there are two different problems that can make a technical term, whether it's programming or not, difficult to understand, difficult to grasp. So one of those problems could be that the concept behind the words, these are just words, so we're talking about concept here. The concept could be really complicated, and that could make it difficult to understand. This is not the case. I'm not saying interfaces are easy to understand, but they're, as far as programming problems go, it's actually a pretty simple concept. However, the problem we're dealing with here is that you've seen this term API used everywhere for almost anything. And that's actually the problem at hand here, is that API is, as we'll see, such a generalized term that probably the reason why you can't really think of a clear picture of what it means to you is because we're literally talking about everything we do almost in programming. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go through a quick whiteboard example in a moment. But before we do that, I just wanted to talk about this particular name. It's not my favorite. So what I did before is I looked in particular at the first two terms in the whole statement here, Application Programming Interface, and I tried to figure out what exactly does this mean, because we're always kind of writing programs, we're always writing applications. Isn't that basically the same thing? So the most important thing is, if you're trying to understand what API means or what it refers to, you can basically just ignore these first two terms, and the one I want you to focus on is the concept of an interface. Okay, so what exactly is an interface? Well, in this particular case, we're simply talking about some way in which either a program or part of a program can communicate with either a program or another part of a program, or a tool, or something like that. So it's about communication. It's about different computer systems being able to send messages to each other, and these different systems might not be on the same platform, or they could be. They might not be in the same language, or they could be. It could be something written by you. It could be something written by somebody else. So as you can see, we're basically talking about everything here. So what I'll do is I'm going to run you through this quick whiteboard example, and hopefully you'll be able to connect some of these examples with something that you do. This is basically a graphical user interface type application example that we're talking about here. So basically what this example looks like is we have some application and it logs a user in. So the user inputs some credentials like an email and a password. They hit a button or click a button, and then those credentials have to pass through a couple different stages in order to do what we want to do with our application, which is to attempt to log in the user. So hopefully this is a fairly familiar example for the people watching this. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll look at three different steps which are generally necessary for this kind of operation. So the first step being validation logic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, all right, I would like to have some kind of validator API. So what I'm saying there is I need to use an interface. So I need to have some way of communicating with some software entity or another application. And it in this case, we're talking about something which is actually within your application. So it could either be something you have written yourself. So you've written a class or something like that called validator, and its interface, its API, is a simple function validate credentials, for example. Oftentimes we'll also see like a third-party library to take care of the particular work of looking at strings, because writing regex, we call it, regular expressions and stuff like that, can be kind of annoying to work with. But it doesn't actually matter whether you wrote this thing yourself or not. We're talking about the first step being something in your application, whether it's a dependency, that gets downloaded and packaged with your application at runtime, or it's literally something you have written yourself, a different part of the same application. That is perfectly acceptable to be considered an API. So for the second step in our login application, the next thing we need to do is we need to make sure that whatever device we're operating on, the application is operating on, has a connection to the internet, because our end goal, as you'll see in a moment, is to send these credentials off to a server, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. So in this particular case, we would generally speaking use what's often referred to as a system API. So that's going to be basically just some software interface which exists in the device which your application is running on top of, and then you would ask that system API for the current network status. Okay, so assuming that our application is actually something which is running on a device that has a connection to the internet, the last thing we need to do is we need to somehow send that data from that application across the internet and into a server. And when I say server, that's literally just another word for computer. Someone else's computer. That's also what cloud means. Someone else's computer. So in this case, we have another form of API, and generally speaking, when we're doing communication across the web, it's usually going to be either REST on top of HTTP or just HTTP. There's different communication protocols for the internet, but this is what we most commonly work with when it comes to application development. So this could be something you handwrite yourself, but generally speaking, you would use some tool like, I'm an Android developer mostly, so we generally speaking use Retrofit. So we use Retrofit to create a REST API, to create the actual interface to the remote server from the client, and client is another word for like the computer that we're currently on type of deal, or the end user is currently on. So that's another perfectly valid example of an API. All right, so what we'll do now is we'll just talk a little bit about this example. So if you ask the question, so what is an API? Does it have to be on the device in the source code of the application? It doesn't have to be, but it can be. Does it have to be something which exposes basically data coming from the actual device into your application? Well, it doesn't have to be, but it could be that. Is it a situation where you have two entirely different systems communicating to each other over a network? Well, it doesn't have to be that, but it certainly could be that. So the point I'm trying to get at here is that basically API is another more complicated word for an interface. If we define an interface simply as a way for different objects which don't necessarily know about each other, different systems which don't necessarily know about each other, to communicate without actually having to know much about each other. And this is the fundamental concept here. So API, generally speaking, refers to libraries or tools that you'll use in your application, but it doesn't have to be that, and it's, like I say, it's inclusive of a huge number of different things. So hopefully that if that doesn't make your understanding of this concept more narrow, at the very least you should start to understand that it's not actually really a big deal to worry about. We're really just talking about a communication channel of some kind. And that's basically all you need to know and worry about this particular term, API, or Application Programming Interface. Basically just means interface. So hopefully that video was useful for you. If it was, please do consider hitting the like button down below. Consider subscribing. And if you have any other questions, then you can leave them in the comment section down below, and I might just get back to you. Thank you for watching. This has been Ryan, and peace out.